I'm Anne Richie Horn Ballard, and I was born on the 1st of February, 1922.
And where were you born?
Washington, D.C. Well, actually, Chevy Chase, Friendship Heights, Maryland, just outside of Washington.
Anne, I read your wonderful memoir, and whoever put together the family tree did a great job.
Oh, that was my husband's daughter, Margaret Ballard.
Wonderful.
Yes.
And you are a descendant of Charles Horn, the same Charles Horn who built Horn's Pavilion on the boardwalk at the end of Rehoboth Avenue in Rehoboth Beach.
Yes.
And I would like you to talk a little bit about the family history and where you fit in.
Well, all I remember hearing about the pavilion was that my grandfather had built this pavilion so that he could put his store out there on the end of the pier. And a hurricane came and took the pavilion away, took the whole pier away. And after that, he built his store back off the boardwalk, and then back off the beach on the main street.
Your grandfather who built Horn's Pavilion was Charles Horn.
Yes, Charles Solomon Horn. Yeah.
The carriage maker, originally.
No, let's see, that was his father was the carriage maker, and he's the one who was making bigger and better carriages when the automobile came in, and that's why he went bankrupt, because other people switched to the automobile, but he kept building the carriages.
So he was the carriage maker, and then his son built Horn's Pavilion?
Yes, his son, grandfather, Charles Horn, is the one who built the pavilion.
Your grandfather, Charles Horn. And Charles Horn had how many children, and what were their names?
Well, he had 6 sons, 3 of whom lived to adulthood. So I only knew the 3. My Uncle Bill, William Arden Horn, and then my father, Albert Fritz Egmont Horn, and then the younger, which was Charles Solomon Horn, Jr. The other 3 I never knew. They died in infancy or very young.
So your father was Albert.
Well, a few people called him Al, but mostly he went by Eggy.
Eggy, okay. And did all 3 sons, were they all involved in the business, running the pavilion?
I don't know. I rather imagine Uncle Bill was active with the sales and with what went on in the pavilion, but I really don't know. All I know about my father's childhood is that he was crazy about the trolley, and he loved to ride the trolley. May I tell this story?
Sure.
Okay. So one day, by the time he was in junior, maybe high school, he went to the motorman on the trolley, and he said, "How do I get to be a motorman on the trolley? I love the trolley." And the story is that the motorman said, "You're a smart kid. Your grades are great. Why don't you go to college and do something special instead of wanting to be a motorman on the trolley?" So my father took his diploma, and he got on his bike, and he bicycled up to Dover, and he entered the college.
Okay.
And he became an electrical engineer.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So then Eggy had you, and
yes.
Do you have siblings?
Yes.
And what
there
are
were
their
4
names?
of us.
Okay.
The oldest was Egmont. He said he was the last Egmont. He would never have a child named Egmont. We called him Monty.
That's a classy name. I like that.
My sister was Christine, named after Christian Frederick, my mother's father, who was a Wilmington man. And then there was me, and I was named after my grandmother, who was Anna Richie, so I was Anne Richie. And then my younger brother, Fred, was named for my grandfather, Christian Frederick. The Fredericks and the Horns were the two families.
Currently, Judge James Horn is the son of Charles Solomon Jr.
Right.
So he is your cousin.
Right.
And can you tell me where Till fits in? Till Purnell fits in.
Uncle Bill, William Horn, had married a Tappan who was a Rehoboth person, and her whole family was there in Rehoboth. Uncle Bill and Aunt Nettie had Matilda, named for an aunt whom he adored, Wilmington aunt, and Tilly, that was Matilda, and Frances Horn, who was had very dark brown eyes, so we called her Blackie.
That's Blackie Nygood.
Okay, that's Blackie Nygood.
And that's how she got her name.
And Tilly is Till Purnell.
She married Skipper Purnell.
Yeah.
And so they just had the two girls.
Yes.
Okay. When you were growing up in Rehoboth Beach, I know that you've written of your trips to Piney Island, but can you tell me a little bit more about those? The stories sound great.
Well, Piney Island was the destination when we wanted to go on a picnic. And the way to get to Piney Island was by boat, either by one of Uncle Charles's motorboats or one of Dan Simpler's rented sailboats, usually the catboat that was, I think, about 18 feet long, and we would put about 16 people on it and sail it over to Piney Island.
Which was where?
Which was in the middle of Rehoboth Bay, as far as I can remember, and was, I thought, a fairly large island, but it was probably pretty little. And when the inlet was enlarged and Rehoboth Bay became a little larger, Piney Island, little by little, disappeared. We tried to save it by putting extra pine trees on it. That didn't work. It just vanished under the water.
But you had some good times there.
Oh yes, we had wonderful times sailing over to Piney. I don't remember many of them, but because I was just a little kid and I didn't get to go on all the trips to Piney. Sometimes Uncle Bill and Uncle Charles and my father would go by themselves over to Piney Island, and sometimes they would find a storm coming up and it will get pretty exciting. But that was a wonderful destination for picnics.
I remember reading, was it your mother preparing the picnics and all of the food that she made to go over there?
Oh yeah, always lots of nice Delaware peaches and tomatoes and deviled eggs and potato salad, traditional stuff. And then something that was called Planter's Punch. And I took a sip of it, and I thought, oh, this is terrible stuff. Oh, this is awful. Why does anybody drink this? That was before I grew up.
And before you figured out it had alcohol in it. Yes.
Yeah, right.
And there were some fun times on the island as well.
Yeah. Well, the time I remember most vividly is when we decided, my sister and I and Till, decided to go buck bathing. And we got in the water, and it was nice and warm, so we weren't in a hurry. And Uncle Charles had his movie camera with him, So he hid our bathing suits and said, "Come on out." And I would have stayed in there till hell froze over. I was too proud or too puritanical to come out. But Till finally decided, well, she wanted out, so she bravely walked out, got her picture on the camera, and then the rest of it, the other two of us came.
On Baltimore Avenue, growing up, do you remember the house number? Or I think you did say it was 10, was it 10 Baltimore Avenue?
Well, 10 Baltimore Avenue, yeah. There was an old house there that was occupied by my grandparents. And I think I mentioned to a couple of people, all I can remember about that house is that there was a can of Dutch cleanser on the bathroom windowsill. That's the only thing I remember about that house. But my father, by that time, had loved to do things like architectural things like designing a house, and so he designed a new house for my grandparents. And he, I believe that he and the other boys helped to build it. And that was the house I remember on 10 Baltimore Avenue, where we had such good times.
Can you tell me about some of those good times?
Well, the downstairs there were three bedrooms, and then there was a disappearing stairway, which of course fascinated us kids, and that saved heat in the winter, and in the summer when everybody congregated, the stairs came down and you went upstairs for more bedrooms, and there were 3 bedrooms upstairs. I don't remember how many beds there were in the bedroom, except that a couple of them were double beds, and I don't know how many kids we got into one double bed, but I do know that the slats always fell out, and then the beds fell down and made a big racket, and then the parents who had told us not to get in bed together because they knew that then we wouldn't sleep, they would come rushing up the steps and find us all crying because our bed was broken down. Well, the older brother, Monty Egmont, took great delight in getting us all to play croquet. There we would be in our bathing suits, having swum so much that we were pretty much waterlogged, and so it was time for a game of croquet. And he wasn't happy until he had everybody crying because he was winning, and he was knocking our balls clear over to the beach. Not quite to the beach, but it seemed like it was that far. So that was one of our favorite games. And the other thing that my sister and I liked to do was to put on some kind of a fancy costume and dance all over the backyard until we danced into the peony bed or the rose bushes and upset my grandmother. She didn't like that very much.
What kinds of things did you eat? Were there, you mentioned Delaware peaches and Delaware tomatoes.
Well, after the inlet was enlarged, of course, there were clams in the bay, and we learned to rake the clams, and that was great fun. But before the inlet was enlarged, when we were just little things, we were taught how to crab. And we would go out on Dan Simpler's pier with either a chicken neck or what was the other favorite bait? I guess just a fish head, and see how many crabs we could catch. Delicious. There were never too many crabs. There was no such thing as having too many.
Never. Not even today there aren't too many. When the day was over and the night came, what sorts of things did you do in the evening to have fun?
Well, of course there were the movies. And sometimes we would be dragged kicking and screaming to the movies because the theater was almost empty, and Uncle Charles didn't like an empty theater. But most of the time, the movies were fair well attended, and sometimes, if the weather was not good, there was an overflow. Then we'd get kicked out. We were not allowed to go to the movie. We were allowed to usher, but not allowed to sit. So we did go to the movies. We did usher, and we walked the boardwalk. I was a little too afraid to flirt with the boys, but I wouldn't say that about my sister or my cousin. They did a little flirting, I think. We liked to sing, and as I said, we liked to dance occasionally. We did plan a show for the movie theater once. We wrote a play, and we were going to sing songs and do dances, and we were just going to occupy that movie theater stage and put on this tremendous show and earn a lot of money. Uncle Charles let us go ahead and rehearse, and we were all set. And when we started to advertise, the parents walked in and said, "No, you can't do the show." But we got even, because later on there was something called the Strolling Marionettes. This was in the days of the CCC, and the CCC boys had nothing to do in the evening, and so they helped us put on a marionette show at the Village Improvement Association. And we rehearsed for that. We did The Ransom of Red Chief. We did The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And we did an original play written by a local man whose name, I believe, was Marlowe. I'm not sure. Is that a familiar name? It was called Lust for Treasure, and I think it was about the Spanish ships that went aground just off the coast, and where we would all go and look for Spanish coins. Sometimes the uncles found them. I never found one. But anyway, we did do a marionette show, and that was a lot of fun.
Oh, wonderful. Other than the movie theater on Rehoboth Avenue that your uncle ran, and was that the Blue Hen?
That was the Blue Hen. It was just off Rehoboth Avenue. I mean, it was on the main drag, but it was not on the boardwalk. Now, on the boardwalk, there was, of course, Funland. And we rode the little cars in Funland. We did the Ferris wheel, and we did the merry-go-round.
What were some of the names of the other stores and businesses right on Rehoboth Avenue that you can recall?
Well, of course, Dolly's saltwater taffy, right? And the popcorn, and the, what was the other thing that they made? I don't know, I guess it was the sweet popcorn. Yeah. And then there was, I think there was a fudge shop there, but I don't remember the name of that. And I don't remember any store names. I remember there was something called the Pink Pony, which we never got to, of course, because that was for grown-ups. I think it was a cocktail lounge, wasn't it? Yeah.
And that was on the boardwalk?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Somewhere between us and the Blue Hen, I mean the Henlopen Hotel.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember what it was like traveling to Rehoboth Beach as a child?
Oh, yes, I remember that. If Daddy had the money, we would go to Annapolis and take the Annapolis-Mattock Peak Ferry. But if Daddy didn't feel as if he could afford that, we would go up to Wilmington and around and down, and we would get to Rehoboth and we would say, "Isn't it wonderful? We only had one flat tire on the way."
Can you estimate about how long that kind of trip took, driving all the way around at that time?
I don't know. I'm guessing maybe 6 to 8 hours, something like that.
How many years did you come to Rehoboth in the summer? From what age to what age, do you think?
Oh my, that's hard to say. I think I probably was carried to Rehoboth in my mother's arms and went there almost every summer for some part of the summer. Or sometimes we would go down for Thanksgiving, even though it wasn't warm and we weren't. One Thanksgiving we did go swimming. Somebody kicked a football into the ocean and I decided to retrieve it, so it was not exactly tropical, but I managed to get the football and come out without freezing to death.
Were most of the stores closed when you came out for that Thanksgiving? Were most of the stores all closed up?
Yes. Everything was pretty well shut down by then.
Do you remember having to dress up when you were on the boardwalk?
Oh, my. Yes, I remember that one of the problems was you stayed out in the sun too long and you got sunburned, and then you didn't really want to get very dressed up in the evening because, you know, you just wanted to take care of your sunburn. But if you were careful enough, then you could manage to get into a little sundress or something like that.
What kinds of things did you hear about the pavilion? What kinds of stories did you hear about?
Well, I just heard that there was this big hurricane and away went the pavilion. And I think sometimes the family would talk about how many times grandfather had gone bankrupt and managed to survive and build up his business again and tried to be the John Wanamaker of Rehoboth Beach, Delaware.
Was Hill's bathhouse there that you remember?
I remember a bathhouse. In fact, I think a couple of times, I don't know why I would have ever used it, but I think I did. We must have come down. I don't know why we wouldn't have gotten dressed at my grandmother's house because it was, you know, just a half a block from the ocean. But for some reason or other, I do remember taking my clothes, hanging them up in the bathhouse, putting on one of those horrible, itchy wool bathing suits and going swimming.
Some of the names of the other families, what other names do you remember?
You mean other families there? Well, of course, the Tappins, because they were my Aunt Nettie's family, and we used to go down to the Tappins' house. Tilly would know who was in the construction business there. I think it was Uncle Bruce. And we would play in the sand that he had accumulated for building cement blocks, I guess. And so we did spend quite a bit of time down with the Tappins. After the Art League got started and we got acquainted with Mrs. Louise Corcoran and her husband, and they were visitors quite frequently. And that was when we got into the marionette show thing. And then, of course, we began to drift over to the Art League to try our hand at a little bit of painting and drawing and things. So I remember the Corcorans rather well. And I got Mrs. Corcoran when she got quite hard of hearing, and we were used to that because I have a brother who's quite deaf, and I'm quite deaf myself.
Is there anything else that you want to say on a topic I might not have touched upon? Anything else you remember that you want to talk about?
Well, I love to tell the story about my older brother when he decided he wanted to have a raft and go out in the ocean. he got a couple of oil drums and made himself a raft. Sort of lashed it together, got his fishing rod, and went out in the ocean. And the Coast Guard came along and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm fishing." Well, before the Coast Guard got there, a fishing boat had come up and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm fishing." And they said, "Well, we haven't caught anything today. Have you caught anything?" "Oh, yes," he said, "I've got 4 or 5 mackerel here." He had beaten this fishing boat with his little raft. And then the Coast Guard came and they said, "What in the world are you doing here in that raft? That's a very leaky boat." And they hauled him back to shore and said, "Don't do that again."
We currently have an exhibit about World War II in Rehoboth Beach. Do you have memories of being in there being in Rehoboth during the war years?
Yeah. Well, I did get down there. I do remember that things had sort of tightened down a lot. Everybody was very conscious of the fact that some Germans had managed to make it to the Jersey shore. They might make it to the Rehoboth shore. So everybody was pretty much on the alert. But otherwise, life went on pretty much as usual, except that most of the guys were in uniform now. Uncle Charles had a mustache that was very much like Hitler's. And one time, to raise some money for, I don't know, war bonds or something to do with the war, he said he would auction off his mustache. So he did. And I don't know whether he did it whisker by whisker, but he did shave off that mustache, and it did raise some money. Quite the details, I don't know, but he looked a fair amount like Hitler with the mustache, and without it, he looked like himself.
Stories about your Uncle Bill?
Oh yes, he would always say, "Well, I don't want anybody to get sand in the food. Now that is your principal job. Keep the sand out of the food. Don't kick your feet up when you're near where we're cooking." And then after the picnic was all over, he would say, 25 people were there and 50 of them were children. If you were sitting at the table and you did not put your napkin in your lap, Uncle Bill would say, "Anne, that is a napkin. It belongs in your lap." He was a stickler about a few things. Oh yes, we had a sun porch there. And the rule was when the adults sat down for their cocktails, no children were allowed on the sun porch. And the other rule was you may play in or you may play out, but you may not play in and out, because he didn't like to hear the slamming doors. And if there was anything that would upset Uncle Bill, it was a screen door that was slamming.
Were you ever there at Christmas?
Oh yes, yeah, Christmas. But Christmas, you know, instead of getting stuck in the snow, you got stuck in the sand when you went out to get the Christmas tree. And you went out to a little pine grove and chopped your own tree down and brought it back. We did have one Christmas where everybody and their brother came, and the mountain of presents was so big I thought we'd never get them all open. And the table for dinner reached from the dining room into the living room. So that it was, you know, it was just 3 tables put together, and all the kids were upstairs and all the adults were downstairs, and that worked pretty well.
Was there a family recipe for eggnog?
Yeah, well, Aggie's eggnog was really quite famous. It had both rum and whiskey in it. And you would make this custard on the stove, and you would watch it very carefully because you didn't want it to curdle. And then when it was just the proper amount of being thick, you let it cool a little bit, and then you added all this whiskey and all this rum, and then you grated some nutmeg on the top of the egg whites and put that on the top of this very good eggnog. There is another uncle's story there, and that was another uncle who trimmed the Christmas tree until 3 in the morning, and everybody was so tired, and everybody was just heading for bed, and he saw one piece of tinsel that wasn't quite hanging straight, and he reached over, fell into the tree, and then they had to start from scratch and do the tree all over again.
Do you remember which uncle that was?
Well, that was Uncle Dick, who was also a lover of Rehoboth Beach, but he was on my mother's side. He was not a Horn, unfortunately, but he was more or less an adopted Horn. He and my father were just like brothers. They were married to sisters, so they had to be brothers.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming all this way and for talking to me. I enjoyed talking to you, and I did absolutely love your memoir.
Did quite well.